think my true perception of wealth personally is more about the word wealthy as opposed to wealth. I think wealth is a finite perception of money, the amount of money people have. I look at it rather as what you do when you're wealthy. So I think when you're wealthy, it's the choices you make and how you spend your money and what you do with it. And if you invested in the future of your country, your fellow man, your children, if you invested in that intergenerational ability to lead a quality life, equity, fairness, etc., which leads me then to my role as the CEO of the Endangered Wildlife Trust. I think environmental organizations globally have an enormous responsibility because that future about that intergenerational equity and the opportunity for future generations to live a quality life is largely resting on the environmental sector today, because it's what we do with the money and that noun in terms of the wealth that is likely going to lead to a wealthy future for other people. If you take a country like South Africa, and in many respects the whole of Africa, the African continent, our current and future prospects for livelihoods across the spectrum comes down to the biodiversity that we have, the natural ecosystems that we have, the ability for people in their millions to rely on rain-fed agriculture, water from natural ecosystems, medicinals from plants and animals as opposed to just popping into a pharmacy or having it delivered to your home. And so the environmental sector really holds the opportunity to use the wealth that we might be given from other people, to give those opportunities to millions of other people to live decent lives going forward. So for me, wealth really is about being wealthy and your ability to pass that on, your ability to share, your ability to make sure that you haven't generated your own wealth on the back of someone else's demise in terms of their ability to earn a living or have an income or have a future life for their children, and largely for our continent to prosper in a way where we see nature and people thriving, which also might mean that there needs to be some balance at some point and that we don't get these extremes in poverty and extremes in capital accumulation that we currently have in the planet today. I think growing up, most of us have this perception that wealth comes from having a good career, a good education, and then earning a good living. But I think one of the things that I've always personally aspired to do is to live life to its fullest and do as much as I can, enjoy the outdoors, enjoy sport, enjoy family, enjoy living a full life, and giving back. I've always been very driven by the social development and NGO sector. For me, it was always about what I could put back and not what I could take out. And as I've embarked on my career, I was very fortunate. I got into a career that allowed me to express that very, very young. So as my career trajectory took off, it just really instilled in me that it was really about having just enough to live on, but also making sure that it was enough to make the right choices, to have the freedom to work in the sector of my choice, to work with other people who could make those choices. And then I think I've largely seen that it's a privilege, I think, to work in a sector where I can afford perhaps not to be as economically wealthy as some of my peers, but to know that what I'm investing and what I'm getting out, and that's affirmation and the privilege that I see, that I have in going to work every single day, actually holds much more meaning. And the older you get, that whole Maslow's hierarchy, I've realized that I've actually been very privileged from a very young age because I've been able to give back and get out in equal proportions. So I think one of the things that is increasingly becoming obvious is that this finite way of looking at wealth only in terms of money, and when you extrapolate that to either a corporate or a country and you look at things in terms of our GDP, we're looking over a 12-month spectrum, and we know that that's largely going to be based on short-term thinking, extractionist thinking. It's going to be based on the ability to measure individuals in a society and look at who the wealthiest are, to look at how they're investing that, and that generally is an investment back into accumulating more wealth. We don't look at it in terms of how we invest that back into society. That's not part of the measures. We don't look at corporate or a country's wealth and health in terms of how we're investing into the future. We don't look at actually the decisions we're making. Are we leaving things in the ground? Are we considering that might have opportunities for future generations? You know, South Africa's constitution speaks very largely about the intergenerational rights, but that's not brought into any measure of our health as a country generally on an annual basis. So I think one of the things that is becoming very, very clear to most people, certainly in my sector, is that we need to start looking within 5 and 10 and 15 year timeframes. People are living for longer, so generation is not even 30, 40, 50 years anymore. It might mean we have to think in terms of 100 years. So bringing that home to South Africa, if we really forecast where we're going in 100 years' time, it's very obvious that we need to be investing back into the natural systems that are likely not just to support the livelihoods in terms of the people that I've mentioned, but are they big attraction to tourism, big attraction to bringing people to our country. It's a big appeal for making sure that we have a much more sustainable exchange of wealth between different nations and people within our own country. Tourism is the sector that has the lowest mean entry age, and it also has the lowest age for unskilled people and also for women. So it has an opportunity to grow and really bring people that are not economically active into the sector and start creating economic activity amongst those people. And of course, in the long term, that helps a country. It helps a country far more than having individuals at the top of the peak that are really earning and accumulating wealth. We need to be investing it back to make sure that all South Africans are economically active, and that our country has a 5, 10 and 15-year plan rather than just an annual cycle of measuring our GDP. So one of the things that always fascinates me when people talk about social responsibility and wealth is that they tend to think that only the wealthy give, and that in actual fact you need to get to a point in your life and your stage of life where you have enough money you can now give. But the irony is, if you look at a ratio or percentage of income to what people give, it's actually in the lower income earners that most people give. And South Africans by their nature are really generous. You know, we talk about people that are, you look at your average traffic light today, who's the person who's likely got a handout to give someone a few coins? It's often not the person in the most expensive vehicle. And one can, you can think about that empathetically if you want to, and you can consider that those people might be under tremendous pressure because a large part of what they own might be, indebted. And in actual fact, the wealthier you become, the more pressure you're under to sustain those lifestyles, and also to keep up debt payments, etc. But there's a very good argument to be made for people who have less, are under less pressure to sustain less, but they actually give more. So I think we need to get away from this argument that you have to have a lot before you give a lot. But I think that the social investment back into South Africa needs to be seen as something that everyone does. It's almost a part of tithing. It's something that we invest back. I think you have to be careful about who you give it to. We should be careful not to sustain bad behaviors. We should be careful not to sustain organizations who perhaps are not going to create sustainability in themselves. In my own organization, in the Endangered Wildlife Trust, my goal is to make sure we have a sustainable future. So it is very much about investing that wealth into investments that will pay off and make sure that I can continue to employ and recruit and retain the best talent in the country. So there is a business imperative, and you have to invest in that. So I would always encourage people who are generous and give, no matter what the scale, is to do a bit of homework and make sure that you are investing that in organizations and individuals who are likely going to turn things around for the future of the country, but not to shy away from giving, because I think giving is also part of us being decent people. It's part of us being a culture and a generation that is empathetic and is kind, and I think kindness goes a long way in the long run. Even if it doesn't help the individual you gave the coins to, I think it definitely it helps the individual that's doing the giving. I always think it depends who you ask if wealth enables happiness. I think that if you ask people who've never had it, of course they'll say yes. I think wealth, as I said earlier, it's about what you do when you're wealthy. If you make better choices, if you can put your kids in private schools and you can get, the best medical attention for sick relative, of course it takes stress away. I think the whole fallacy about does money buy happiness, I think is very simplistic. I think money buys choices, and that's what everybody wants. People want to be able to make choices. But it can also be a trap, because it does trap you into a lifestyle that becomes very materialistic. And as one of my closest friends always likes to say, she says it's just wêreld so goed. It really doesn't matter at the end of the day. I think the brands that South Africa like to chase, the fact that we can't have one TV, we must have 5, and we can't have one car, we must have 6, and it's got to be a new one every few years. I think some people find it just exhausting once they get into that rat race, and then they start making the wrong choices. So for me, wealth is about being able to have the freedom of choices. I think it's definitely an enabler to a point, and then half of it is about how you spend it. You don't take it to your grave. So if you spend it on creating a world in which you're happy and you're getting the most fulfillment out of life, you've made sure you've looked after the future of your children, but you've made sure you've looked after the future of your country, then I think in that case, wealth has enabled you not just to live a comfortable life, but to also be the best person you can be. I love talking to young people when they embark on their career, because I like to be controversial, but that's because I'm being honest in being controversial. The first thing I say to them is, don't get attached to the right job, don't get attached to a job for salary, and don't get attached to a job for job security. In fact, I've often challenged young people to say that if you were guaranteed, as soon as you left university, you would be given a job on one condition, and that is that you were exempt from all the labor legislation in this country, would you take it? And it really flabbergasts me that I've maybe had about 20% of young people who've said they would and the rest wouldn't. And I think that's very dangerous. It indicates a mindset that young people are going into their first career wanting security, they're wanting a salary, they're wanting the perks, they're wanting the benefits, and they're not considering about whether or not they're going to add value, whether or not they're going to be the most valuable staff member that company ever had, whether or not that company is going to never let them go because they're adding so much value. So I think that should be your mindset, is your first 5 years of your career are really about getting exposure and learning how you can add value to the world. It's not the other way around. And so that's the best advice I say. The rest will come. But if you're not adding value to a company, no one's going to touch you. So be very careful what your objectives are in your first job, and be very careful about why you think that company should employ you, because really they don't have to. They have choices. So make sure that you are the right choice, and make sure they want to keep you, not because they have to.